I recently had the pleasure of checking out Bret Weinstein's Coalition of the Reasonable, and there was an extremely interesting and intelligent gentleman named Cameron Stevens who made a comment, and he used the word quintessence not in the way it's ordinarily used. He used it referring to a philosophical concept. And I asked a brief question about it, what the difference between quintessence and essence was. And he says it was like the essence of the essence. And it struck me because, of course, it contains the quint at the beginning, which suggests five, and indeed, we can see here in the etymology that it's essentially the fifth essence, or a fifth essence, or an essence of five. And of course, this reminded me immediately of the five-element theory. And it occurred to me that you can think of five-element theory as being what is required for essence to, let's say, persist. So I know that quintessence is thought of as the fifth element in the Western element system. I don't know a lot about the Western element system. So I'm not going to talk about this from the point of view of the Greeks or from any other kind of Western point of view. I'm going to talk about it from a Westerner's perspective of five-element theory. And first I'm going to describe, well, let me say one more thing about the historical thing, which is that my sense is that in the ancient world there was a fair amount of cross-pollination. And so it is possible that you could have something which in one part of the world refers to a fifth essence, right? So if you had only four elements in the ancient world, in the Western ancient world, let's say, and there was an awareness of five elements from the Eastern tradition, well, you could imagine that perhaps there would be this theoretical quintessence that people would start to talk about. At any rate, let's put aside the Western thing. One of the things that I find most interesting about the Chinese conception of five elements is that it has a set of relationships built into it that, as far as I understand, makes it a bit more interesting than the Western element system. And so the traditional terms are seen here, depicted before you, with the primary cycle. So the Shen cycle is the cycle of production, and so we can see quite clearly that, let's start here at water. Water produces wood. I think you could say that wood is a representation of life in general. So we can get to that more later. But basically, nothing's going to grow without water. The wood naturally produces fire. And you could say that in the case of life in general, there is a metabolism required. So there's this kind of processing. And then there's a byproduct of the fire, which is essentially ash, which falls to earth. So you get that residue of the fire. And then over the course of time and accumulation, you get forces which come to bear that cause the earth to create formations. You get, in essence, rock, hardness, structure, right? And then the transition from metal to water is one which is mysterious, but I think that in some respects that's what points us to a deeper interpretation of what's going on here, because these are all poetic terms, and they're not really talking literally about water, wood, fire, earth, and metal. These are being used as an example of a deeper pattern, and that's what I'm going to talk about in the next slide. But let's just continue with the traditional way of interpreting it for a moment. It's interesting to note that metal is a conductor of the flow of electricity, And so you could say that there's something about structure that organizes the potential for conducting energy. And that's essentially what water is representative of. It's representative of an available energy source. At any rate, I'll get to that more in a moment. Let's take a look at some of the other cycles. So we took a look at the Shen cycle, which is production. Let's take a look at the co-cycle. Co-cycle is one of control. So water controls fire. That's pretty obvious, right? Fire controls metal. If you want to shape metal, if you want to control it, you heat it up again, and that's what makes it malleable. Metal controls wood. The classic example is you use an axe in order to take down a tree. But a more generalized way of looking at it is that it's the structure of things that controls what life is capable of doing. And then wood controls earth. So the classic example is that the root system is what holds the earth together. And earth controls water. So it's the banks of a river that control the flow of the water. It's interesting, right? It's kind of a neat interrelationship. There's another one. I just call it the destructive cycle. I can't remember if there's a Chinese word for this, but it's rather clear that heading in the opposite direction of the Shen cycle has a destructive effect. Fire destroys wood. Wood destroys, it sucks up water, right? Water corrodes metal, right? And how does metal destroy earth? Let's cover that one in a second. Earth, obviously, you can extinguish fire by throwing earth on top of it, right? So the byproduct of things, once it is incorporated into a structure, is no longer a free element. It's like it's been subsumed into a structure. So like you could say that earth, in a sense, is like the raw material byproduct of some kind of a process, which is what fire is. So life is this kind of process that produces a byproduct, right? That would be your Shen cycle. And that byproduct is then turned into the next generation. It's like the raw material for, let's say, the building or the conditions, overall conditions that life must then adapt to. So once the materials, the raw materials have been used up, you could say that, well, yes, metal, that process of determining order is something that has scooped up the resources available for constructing that order. So that was a long-winded way of saying something. Let's take a look at what I believe is a more flexible interpretation of the five elements. So as I mentioned before, we can think of water as available energy. And life is essentially something which is able to take energy that's available and have some intention that it will use it for, which is, of course, the action. And the action has a byproduct, we'll say. Could be, you can think of it as a product or a byproduct. And that product is then turned into some kind of order. In order for essence to be meaningful, it has to last, right? So you could say that something which has only a momentary existence doesn't really have much essence to it, right? The essence is the capability of this cycle continuing. And so whatever order that's established has to be able to conduct energy for the next generation. And I think you could say that this is a model for a description of how things function in the material world. In order for things to have success, for there to be succession, for there to be something, a living thing which persists, but it's the living in interaction with what we see as inert matter. And so the living takes what energy is available to it and it puts it to its purpose, and there is a byproduct of that, and that byproduct has to be contended with, it has to be dealt with. And so the process of living is something which modifies the environment to the point where adaptation is necessary. And that is the essential set of dynamics for life to continue. That's why we could call this essence, right? Now, if it's true that this way of reinterpreting it is accurate, then all of the other cycles should make sense. And I haven't checked to see whether or not that's the case, but here's a representation of all of the other cycles. Now, it's in this different order, so it's a little confusing. But, okay, it's too confusing to do it that way. I'm just going to do it using the Shen cycle. I think it's pretty obvious that you're producing each of these from the prior state. Now, can you say that available energy produces intent? Well, in the presence, I would say that, yeah, if you're talking about a living thing, then available energy, the first thing that it produces in a living thing is, oh, what can I do with that energy? And then intent obviously produces action. Action obviously has a byproduct associated with it, some reaction, subsequent cause and effect, right? And then you could say there's a little bit of a mystery in this transition, although if you don't somehow put things into order, you could say there must be some sort of an intent involved in the production of order, right? But or you could say that there is a kind of inexorable thermodynamic process that creates a kind of order irrespective of intent, and that order will produce a kind of new energy possibility, or at least within the context of the essence required for life, there will have to be an order that allows for energy to be available in order for life to continue. So, what about the co-cycle, controlling? Does available energy control action? It sure does, right? Does action control order? Well, there you go. There's how you could say action, irrespective of intent, is going to definitely play a huge role in the formation of some order. Now, does order control intent? Of course it does, right? The order determines the limitations upon what kind of intent is viable. Does the intent control the product? Well, if the intent is accurate, it does. I would say that there is a relationship, but not necessarily a direct relationship between intent and product. And certainly intent will do its best to produce the product it wants, although whether or not it actually does is another question. But it will control that product to the best of its ability. And does the product control the available energy? Well, first of all, the fact that you've used the energy is a control on the energy. So the product is sort of a representation of the final stage of that process. But I think also byproducts have a tendency to interfere with the process of energy utilization. And it requires a sort of new generation in order to produce a new energy availability for the process to become, well, less lossy. Okay. I think that's a pretty good overview of what I wanted to convey. I actually am making this video for Cameron, but I figured it would be interesting for the Assembly of Silence audience and the Taiji Reality audience. I'll post it to both places. There's one more thing I wanted to mention, which is that if we recall the original words here, I want to do it in this form, not the other form, for a very specific reason. It has to be noted that in the Chinese system, fire and water here are represented as symbols. And those symbols are... So, those of you on the Taiji Reality channel know that this is the primary axis of the postnatal. And indeed, you can correlate this within the postnatal arrangement if you want to. I'm not going to get into that now, but the reason I want to mention this is that this suggests two things. One, postnatal obviously has to do with the things which are born, the things of this world, the marriage of spirit and matter. It suggests a more essential essence. We could call it perhaps a triessence. And I would make the claim that the triessence is represented by the trigrams, and that the prenatal arrangement of the trigrams is a representation of, we might say, divine essence. And the postnatal is the transformation that occurs when spirit is embedded within matter. What happens to consciousness? Because the crux of the theory that I've proposed regarding the trigrams is that they are a representation of the fundamental aspects of consciousness. That is, sense, memory, and imagination. And so what we see here is an interesting set of models discussing both spiritual and physical processes that are linked to each other. And if you're interested in exploring the triessence further, please take a look at the Taiji Reality YouTube channel, and there are also a number of papers on the Taiji Reality Substack, taijireality.substack.com. In the section to the right, that's sort of the highlight papers. I can't remember what I called it. At any rate, hopefully that wasn't too long-winded. I hope Cameron and everyone else found it interesting. Thanks for your attention. Adios.